This is Ines, the scriptwriter behind some of Ali Abdaal's top performing videos. She consistently writes videos that get millions of views, but sound so natural you probably never thought they were scripted. But how does she do that?
I feel like YouTube is now going through a trend where we're moving away from the highly edited, very polished videos, and people are looking for authenticity. They're looking for realness, and they're really looking for this kind of like trust and connection with the person behind the camera.
In this episode, you will learn the 5-step process to write scripts that can make your videos go viral.
And then once you're able to focus on those 5 things, you've pretty much written a whole script.
The biggest script writing mistakes holding you back from success.
The biggest mistake that script writers typically make is just
how to write the perfect hook.
I think the key things to keep in mind when writing a hook is, firstly, you want to...
And a secret about retention you haven't heard anywhere else.
2 scripts can reveal the same key insights, have the same core pieces of information and the same core answers to the same set of questions, but have different retention.
What would you suggest beginner YouTubers focus on in their scripts?
I would say there are 5 kind of key steps. The first is spending quite a lot of time on what the idea is. So really nailing, is there a demand for the thing that I want to talk about? And is this a good thing? Like, is this a good topic for me to write a script about? So really nailing that idea would be point number 1. Point number 2 would be focusing a lot of time on what the title of the script should be. And I would even go so far as to say that don't start writing the script or the hook or anything else until you have the title that you want to go with. And ideally, you might even have kind of 2 titles that you want to test and alternate between. And the reason why it's important to nail the title before writing the script is the title really offers the framing of the script. And without that, it's difficult to make sure that you're getting the first 60 seconds of the script correct, which then leads me on to point 3. So the first 60 seconds of the script is often referred to as the hook. And the goal in that first 60 seconds is catching the audience's attention and making sure that you've met the expectation of what the title suggests. You're giving sufficient information, but also withholding sufficient information so that they want to keep on watching after that first 60 seconds. So yeah, point number 3 would be focusing on how to really write those first 60 seconds so that you can capture people's attention. The 4th thing I think they should focus on is after they've written the hook, now the meaty bit of the script comes. And the biggest mistake that script writers typically make is just writing the rest of the script without much consideration of how you want to structure the different bits of information. The thing with long form YouTube videos is if you're trying to tell people quite a lot without thinking about how you want to break those pieces down, it's easy to either confuse your audience or cause them to lose interest because you're not delivering that information in a sufficiently structured way. So yeah, the 4th thing to focus on is like, how would you structure all the content you're trying to deliver in a way that's digestible, that's simple and easy for people to remember and to take away. And then the last thing to focus on is to get good at writing those little bits of content after you've already created the structure. So what I mean by this is, say that after you've written the first 60 seconds of the script, which is the hook, you know that you now want to have 3 parts of the script. And within those 3 parts, you might have, 3 additional points. So I would say focus on getting good at writing those individual pieces because the script is basically a lot of those individual pieces combined. Yeah. So, and then once you're able to focus on, those 5 things, you've pretty much written a whole script.
That sounds really interesting. So if we were to look at the scripts that you wrote for Ali, is there any specific script that stands out to you that, let's say, your favorite script? I presume you wrote many scripts for him, but could you sort of pick one favorite one?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite ones would have to be the video about sleep myths. That is currently one of the top performing videos on the channel. And one of the reasons why this script was so fun to work on was because the foundation of that script was actually a podcast interview that Ali did on his podcast called Deep Dive with a sleep expert called Russell Foster. So what this meant was we approached the script from quite a different angle because it required some kind of dialogue between what the podcast interview offered and how we would approach a typical script. So it required a somewhat like different creative and collaborative process because we had to firstly select the sound bites from a 2-hour podcast interview that we felt like would really work for a 10 to 12 minute YouTube video, and then find a narrative around how to make those sound bites flow between each other and how to create that overarching framework for the script. So it was very fun to kind of think about these two mediums in a podcast form and a YouTube video and how we could bring that crossover together. We approached it from many different angles, and the overall framing that we landed on, which was to think about sleep myths, I thought was also very effective because we're effectively tapping into people's negativity bias. We're telling them what they're doing wrong when it comes to sleep hygiene and sleep routines, rather than directly telling them what they should be doing. And I think that's always quite an effective way to capture people's attention.
Interesting. You said something there that really stood out to me, that maybe it stood out to me because I'm personally struggling with it a little bit. You said that in the hook, you need to focus on the information that you're giving out, but also on the information that you're omitting from the hook. So to leave a curiosity gap. How do you distinguish between the two? How do you choose what information to leave and what information to give away?
I think a general rule for deciding what information to keep versus delivering, early on is you generally want to withhold the answer to the question that you are posing in the audience's mind. So an example of this would be, let's go back to the sleep myths video.
And generally when I talk to people in this area, it's hard to figure out what's actually good advice to follow and what is bad advice to ignore. Like for example, Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, is very good, but there was this whole craze around, oh my God, I need to get my 8 hours. Otherwise, if I don't get my 8 hours, I'm going to develop Alzheimer's disease and all this cardiovascular problems. And all of this feeds into this thing called sleep anxiety.
You've convinced people from the title and from the hook that what we want is a good night's sleep. And not only that, you want a sleep routine that helps you that allows you to, fall asleep at a similar time at night, get 8 hours of sleep at night. We've convinced people already that that is the thing that we're all aiming for. So we have agreement on what the outcome is. We've already reviewed that that is what people want. And perhaps we've even provided information on why it is that we want that, for health benefits and so on. So the information that I would withhold is how we get there, because that is the thing that will get them to that outcome, if that makes sense.
So you're sharing the goal, you're sharing the dream, like that's the dream and that's why this should be your dream. But I'm not gonna tell you just yet how you should achieve it, how you can achieve it.
Exactly. So it's very context dependent, right? But in the example of the sleep myth script, it's like we have an agreement that the goal is a good night's rest and a good sleep routine to get us there. But I'm going to withhold from you what exactly are the 7 key things you should do that will allow you to get there. And I actually haven't seen that many podcasters doing a similar approach where they turn their podcast episodes into long form YouTube videos. We see a lot of 2-hour podcast recordings on YouTube, and we also see a lot of shorts. But I feel like there could potentially be space for podcasters to turn, a podcast episode into several long form YouTube videos. And it's a fun, creative way to use existing material that's already been recorded.
So this is sort of an untapped market that you guys uncovered. Like you already had this asset, which was the interview, and you're like, how can we do more? So instead of just taking it and turning it into a bunch of shorts, which many other creators are doing, you took a more elaborate approach and created a long form which used the same asset. You could still do the shorts, of course, and still use the long form, but that was like a mid-tier production, which turned out to work very, very well. Again, one of the top performance on Ali's channel. Like you said that you took the miss angle, like tapping into people's negativity bias and stuff like that. But what specifically would you say were the storytelling techniques that worked so well? Like, why did it capture people's imagination and say in such a good way?
I think when it comes to framing, there are kind of like two broad ways to frame things. One is you try to frame it in terms of an extremely dream outcome or a very positive outcome that people want. So, being a millionaire, being super successful, getting the dream guy, getting the dream girl, these are like dream outcomes that people would want. So that's one way of framing things. And the other way of framing things is to frame it in terms of things that people don't want. In this specific example of this script, it would be, being extremely tired. Other examples might be suffering from a certain thing, encountering failure, being poor, that kind of thing. So when it came to the sleep angle, it kind of seemed clear that framing it in terms of something that people want to avoid, this feeling of extreme tiredness, this feeling of burnout, feeling like you've got to go through your work week with, 20% battery or 2% battery, was the thing that was more compelling than, hey, here's how you feel super recharged at work every day. I think tapping into that sense of this is the thing that everybody wants to avoid, because I think that's something that everybody has experience with, was more effective. In addition to that, I think another thing that was good in terms of capturing attention is around that time, and the key point here is there are cycles in terms of how popular a topic is. And the thing is that at that time there were a couple of books that came out and a lot of like podcast episodes about how to optimize your sleep, how to sleep better, and in the importance of sleep. So you might have heard of Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, which was really doing its rounds. And Russell Foster, the sleep expert that we interviewed on the podcast, had somewhat of a different take to the popular narrative on how to optimize sleep. And so I think we also had that working in our favor because there was so much buzz about sleep health, sleep hygiene. And so we were able to also take advantage of that, that underlying interest on that topic.
We are talking about the point of revealing information in a specific cadence and a specific pace to have the highest retention that we possibly can. Again, to serve the algorithm gods. But do you actually think that it's also beneficial for the viewers? Like, is it better for the viewer that the information is being laid out in this specific way?
I would say anecdotally, there are benefits to delaying revealing the answer if what you're doing isn't just, withholding for withholding's sake. But say if you are using that space where you've withheld that information to set up background context that you feel like would help the viewer's understanding eventually, then if you use that space wisely, I think that would ultimately help them understand the core thing that you're eventually delivering better. So that's one point. And then the second thing is a lot of the times the way that people withhold information is they tell a story beforehand. They tell a story that's related to that point that they eventually deliver. And there's a lot of evidence showing that we remember things better if it comes through a story form. So whereas we're not going to remember it very well if it comes through the form of a statistic or a number. So if you use that space where you've retained information or you've withheld information in a way that facilitates the audience's understanding, that tells them a story that you feel like they're more likely to remember, then I think eventually that will help the audience understand the thing that you want to communicate. They'll understand it better than if you were just to deliver it straight upright.
Because like the easiest way would be to just say like a list of 5 things, just do this, and that, and it would be a video of like a minute and a half. But instead we're going to we want to explain to you why this is the case, like why these are the 5 things that you have to do. We're going to tell it to you by first telling you a story, and the story makes it more memorable, and also like you become more engaged as the viewer with it. So if you consume it, like there's more chance that you'll actually remember and learn something, as opposed to if that's the 5 things, okay, and you'll just forget about it after like a minute or two.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one example of this is, as you know, on Ali's channel, we talk a lot about productivity advice. And one technique that we talk about quite a lot is something called the 5-minute rule. And the 5-minute rule is a technique that helps people overcome procrastination. So the idea here is if I'm really dreading doing that one specific thing, I tell myself, okay, it's okay if I don't complete the whole thing. I just need to do it for 5 minutes. And that's the 5-minute rule. Now, so suppose I'm writing a YouTube script about how to get over procrastination. The way I would do it if I'm not withholding information is I would say something like, tip number 1 is to use the 5-minute rule. The 5-minute rule says X, Y, Z, and I repeat what I just said. Another way of doing this is to tell it in a more interesting way, which would involve telling some kind of story first and then revealing the tactic of the 5-minute rule. So an example would be, when I was in medical school, one technique I would often use is listening to the song Bohemian Rhapsody. Either Bohemian Rhapsody or some other, you could list a couple of songs. And then you kind of explain, well, what is it that's special about Bohemian Rhapsody? Well, the thing about Bohemian Rhapsody is it's about 5 minutes long. And then, you would say, I really liked the song Bohemian Rhapsody, and I found that it was super effective for my studying. And like whenever I struggled to get started with it, I would just put Bohemian Rhapsody on, and I told myself I would just do it until the song is finished. What I'm trying to say here is the first approach where you deliver that information and you show that answer straight away, it's effective and it's very direct. But I think the audience member is more likely to remember Bohemian Rhapsody, and that is a more interesting take on the same point that you're trying to make, because you're providing a little bit more context, a little bit more of a flowery, a softer background. And I think it just wraps up the story and the core point in a nicer way.
Often when writing scripts, I feel like I'm writing in a more formal way. And when I'm reading it, it feels unnatural. So
Right.
how can I write a script that will feel natural when reading it out of the camera?
Yeah, my general rule would be to write as though you're speaking. In a lot of traditional writing books, there's always this term called the writer's voice, or I think writer's voice is the term that people use the most. And I've always been a little bit confused about what that exactly means, and like, how do you find your voice as a writer and that kind of thing. But I think it really just boils down to finding the way you would speak if you were speaking to friends over a dinner table. Because, and I think one of the really important reasons for this is I feel like YouTube is now going through a trend where we're moving away from the highly edited, very polished videos, and people are looking for authenticity. They're looking for realness, and they're really looking for this kind of like trust and connection with the person behind the camera. And one really important way to get that connection and that trust is to be able to speak like you are speaking to somebody that you know in real life. And that comes through words. It comes through, scripting in a way where the words are like words that you would actually say in real life, and the sentences and the phrasing is the way you would actually say something in real life. Yeah, so I think the way to avoid sounding overly formal or, and I think this is a mistake that, we often run into when you use something like ChatGPT, is the writing ends up seeming very stiff and very like rigid and very professional. And you want to, tone that down by really making sure everything on the page is what you would feel like you would say to friends over a dinner table.
The initial instinct will be to write in a more formal way, but then like we have to go over the script and make sure like that I would actually say those words, like sort of not dumb it down, but simplify the language.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is a massive mistake that I made when I started, because I came, as I said, I came from quite an academic background. There's a certain style to writing in academia that is definitely very professional and very proper. When I first joined Ali's, we had a writing guide called Ali Style Writing Guide. I'm not sure if it's still called that, but it's something like that. And we had, rules like, what are some phrases that Ali often says on camera? And you notice like a phrase like, hey friends, is something that comes up a lot. He would prefer not, on a script, I shouldn't write you are as two separate words. I should use a contraction. You're here for da-da-da rather than you are here for da-da-da-da-da. So little things like that might seem really small and really subtle and like you can overlook it, but they're actually, add up bit by bit, sentence by sentence to really form the image of who you're coming across on camera. So it is worth paying attention to those little things. I think vocabulary is another way in which you can make yourself sound more conversational. So one example is we try to avoid using the word difficult, and we would also say, if we're trying to say something's difficult, we don't want to say it's difficult. We say something like, it's really hard to do X rather than it's really difficult to do X. And those two words mean the same thing, but hard is a simpler word, it's a shorter word, and it comes across as more conversational.
I really like the idea of sort of having a writing guide, like a style guide for writing. I come from a design background, so I often worked with sort of brand books
Right.
with the corporate clients that I worked with. This is sort of like the brand book, but for writing, but for speaking, like the way you express yourself. So brand book would be the way that you express yourself visually. These are the guidelines for how you should express yourself visually, and the writing guide would be um, sort of the same thing, but for another area of the business. The next question that I wanted to ask you is, how do you do your research? Again, coming from an academic background, creating videos for YouTube, how do you go about it?
Mm. Yeah. Going about research, I would say it very much depends on the topic of the script. But generally, they're kind of, I think about it in two broad categories. The first is a very general, like secondary search. And what I mean by secondary search is like I'm looking for articles, blog posts, things like that, that somebody else has curated and kind of synthesized the information for me. So when I do secondary search, it would be a very general, like Google search or any other search engine. And the idea is just to make sure that I'm not missing any gaps on that topic. I might also look into like books on that topic. Book summary websites like Blinkist and Shortform are like super helpful for this purpose. So especially if you're working towards a tight deadline, don't have time to read that whole book, those book summary videos are fantastic. And then the second category would be, primary research. Yeah, so primary research is, a lot more time intensive. And so you only really want to tap into this angle if you feel like it's super important to talk about something that isn't currently available on the internet. So what does primary research look like? That might mean, interviewing experts or authors who have really dived deep into this topic. And we're lucky at Ali to be able to do this through the podcast. And if it's not possible for you to do, a one-on-one interview with these experts, there's also a lot of, podcasts and interviews out there online where you can draw this information from. Another example of, a primary search would be looking at academic journals that address that topic that you want to dive into and looking into, the findings of those articles and whether there are kind of key insights from there that you can draw and convey to a broader audience.
So you're sort of starting with what's already out there, and if like the information that you wanna talk about is already widely available, then you'll go into this technique that you call secondary research. And if it's not already there, like in a very visible spot, for example, an article that you find easily on Google, then you'll dive deeper, go into interviews with experts, stuff like that.
Exactly.
Going back to one of the points that we spoke of earlier, we spoke of hooks quite a lot, and hooks are very important for a video success on YouTube. How do you think about writing hooks, and how would you sort of can you give a framework for writing the perfect hook, if there is such?
But I do think there are some general tips and techniques to make sure you're writing a good hook that captures the audience's attention. Before I go into those framework though, I do think it's important to bear in mind that I feel like an effective hook differs from creator to creator. So there are some creators for whom, because of their style, it's more effective for them to deliver the information, to really like be direct and deliver a lot of the information within the first 60 seconds of the video. And that's almost the way that they've gained an audience and build a connection with the audience. I think Ali is a good example of somebody for whom a hook would work better if it's more straight and direct. And his very early videos, even before I started working with him, he would do a conclusion up front and tell you where the timestamps are if you want to go and look into further detail. On the other hand, I think there are some creators for whom a hook works well if it's a more story-based hook where the information isn't reviewed within this first 60 seconds, but you're really setting the scene to make people want more and to prep people up for the information that's coming further down the line. I think an example of somebody who does this would be, Johnny Harris. Rarely does, because of the nature of the topics he talks about, rarely does he give away the answer within the first 60 seconds. A lot of what the first 60 seconds is doing for him is setting the scene, really creating the vibe of the story that he eventually wants to tell, and just really sucking the audience in. So then going back to the framework, so regardless of which kind of creator you are and what kind of hook works better for you, I think the key things to keep in mind when writing a hook is, firstly, you want to clarify the topic that you're talking about and be clear about what the audience can expect by watching the remaining 10, 12, 30 minutes of the video. And why that's important is the first thing that the audience will see is the title and the thumbnail when they go on YouTube. And the hook should clarify that it at least matches what the title and the thumbnail would suggest that they're going to get from that video. So that's point number one when writing a hook, so clarify what they'll get. The second is to build a connection with the audience, and to be really clear that, you can be the trusted expert on the thing that you're going to talk about. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be an expert in the sense of you've done in-depth research about it. It could just be, you have the life experience, or you have a personal story to share. And that's the reason why the audience should be watching you talk about this topic for the rest of the video. So you want to, ideally communicate that within the first 60 seconds and build that connection. And then the third thing is to keep people watching. And, as we spoke about previously, there are various ways to do that. And one of the key ways is while you're telling them what to expect, which was point number one in the framework, you're also not telling them all the answers straight away. So you're kind of withholding stuff that they want to get later on in the video.
Like the framework for the hook would be tell the people that they are in the right place. So you saw a thumbnail and a title, you started watching the video, you want to tell the viewer, hey, you arrived at the right place, you should keep watching the video. Then I'll tell them in the hook, that's why you should be listening to me. Either I have some relevant life experience, or I'm an expert, I've researched this topic a lot. So like going... sort of basing my authority on this topic in this way or another. And then lastly, this is why you should keep listening or watching the video, because you don't have the full picture yet. So like where we will get, but you don't yet know how we'll get there. For example, with the sleep video, that by watching this video, you will learn some tips and techniques on how to sleep better, but I won't tell you them right now. If you want to learn them, you'll have to watch the video.
Exactly.
So like that would be the setup for the perfect hook.
Right, exactly.
That leads us to the rest of the video. And now after we have like our first 30 to 60 seconds of the video done, we only need like another 10 or to 30 minutes, as you said,
exactly.
of video. How can you keep viewers' retention throughout the video? Like how can you make sure that they don't lose interest throughout? We spoke about story and the pace of revealing information. Do you think there are any other sort of ways that we can think about retention throughout the video?
So I think about retention in terms of the timing of when key pieces of information is revealed. And usually the key piece of information is an answer, is the one-liner answer to the question that you're setting up. And, as we said previously, there are various ways of how to answer that. One way would be you give that answer straight up, right? Example, how do I force myself to get started on something that I really don't want to do? Answer, use the 5-minute rule. Another option would be, the question would be, how do I force myself to get started on something I don't want to do? You tell a story about listening to Bohemian Rhapsody when you're studying, which then leads you on to the key answer of use the 5-minute rule. So yeah, I think about retention a lot in terms of when you're revealing that information. And going by this definition, 2 scripts can reveal the same key insights, have the same core pieces of information and the same core answers to the same set of questions, but have different retention because the information is revealed in different at a different timing.
So one thing that I often hear when researching sort of script writing advice are 2 phrases that come up a lot, um, and I would love to hear your take on them.
Right.
The first one would be micro hooks, and the other one would be a grand payoff. So what are those? Can you define those for us? And let us know how to use them effectively. So they seem like very powerful script writing techniques and storytelling techniques. What are they? How do we use them?
Okay, micro hooks. Okay, so let's think about the term micro hooks in contrast to the more common term hooks. So if the hook is the first 60 seconds of the video that aims to capture the audience's attention to make them watch for the whole length of the video, then a micro hook is a miniature version of the hook that's contained within the script itself. So one good way of thinking about micro hooks is if you divide that video timeline into 3 different sections, then you know that there are 3 sections. And imagine the micro hook as being the start of those little sections themselves. And the goal of that micro hook is to get people to keep on watching until the end of that section. So for example, let's say that you are writing a script about, actually, give me an example of a script that you want to write about.
Let's say I want to make a video explaining why the Mr. Beastification of YouTube is not actually beneficial for creators.
So you're writing a YouTube video about why Mr. Beastification, which in layman, which means over editing your video and editing it at a super high pace is not the way to grow on YouTube. Okay, so let's imagine that you're writing that video. So a natural way, which goes back to your previous question about what scriptwriters should focus on. So a natural way to structure that script would be you first make the case of, why it's a mistake to follow Mr. Beast's strategy. Okay, so let's imagine a very simple script. There's 2 parts. The first part is you're convincing people it's a mistake to follow Mrs. Beast's strategy. And the second part of the video is then you tell people what is the future direction if it's not going to be Mr. Beast's strategy. So 2 parts. Now, think about what a micro hook would look like then if you've got 2 parts of the video. The first micro hook then would be trying to convince people why Mr. Beast's strategy isn't the way to go. So you'd have a micro hook, and the only purpose of that hook is try to convince people to watch part 1 of that video that tells you why Mr. Beastification is wrong. Then your second micro hook would be the hook and the hook for the second part of the video. And the purpose of that hook is to only convince people why they should keep on watching the rest of the video or keep on watching the rest of that part, which tells you what is the future direction. And the reason why I think it's a useful framework for thinking about things and a useful definition is because a lot of YouTube videos, especially in the educational space, delivers information like sequentially or either in a list, right? So, and given that a lot of information and a lot of, tips are given in little chunks across a YouTube video, it's less of a daunting task to think about, okay, how do I keep viewers watching for these 3 minutes? And I only need to think about the micro hook serving these 3 minutes rather than thinking about one hook for the entire 10 minutes.
Sort of breaking it down into smaller tasks. Like it's easier to make sure that you'll listen to me for the next 1 to 3 minutes rather than making sure that you'll listen to me for 10 or 15 minutes, because by the middle of it, you'll already have forgotten what I said at the beginning.
Exactly. Grand payoff basically is the answer to the question that the audience is coming for. Did you ever have you played that game called Cluedo when you're a kid where somebody murders somebody and then you need to find that murderer in the house? Actually, don't know if
Oh,
that's
yeah, yeah.
the gist of the.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Sure.
But if you think about like any story that involves a murder that happens right at the start of the film, the whole film is basically about finding the murderer, right? So think about grand payoffs in that way. So if you're an audience watching a murder movie, the grand payoff happens towards the end of the film where you find out who the murderer is. The murderer gets caught, and then like justice is restored. So the grand payoff is, oh my God, I know who the murderer is. The same thing applies for YouTube videos. The grand payoff is you finding out the answer to that thing that you really wanted, to the question that was set up at the start of the video. So in the example of why Mr. Beastification isn't the way to grow on YouTube, the grand payoff is I understand why it's not the way to grow on YouTube and why it might lead to XYZ bad outcomes. And I now know what is the way to go forwards. In the case of the sleep myths video, the grand payoff is, okay, I now know that these are the things I really shouldn't do if I want to have a good night's rest and I want to optimize my sleep routine.
I think that would be a good place to wrap it up. Thank you so much for the time. That was really, really interesting. Always a pleasure talking to you.
No, thank you guys. Yeah, super interesting questions. And it's nice to reflect on some of these questions that I typically actually don't think about very much when I'm writing. So it's nice to get the opportunity to break it down. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ines.